The smell of hide glue and beeswax hung thick in the October air of Thomas Hartwell's workshop. That particular mixture that spoke of centuries-old craft meeting the industrial age of 1873. Outside, Brighton hummed with the nervous energy of progress, steam engines whistling at the station, carriages clattering over cobblestones, the new gas lamps already lit, though dusk had barely settled over the narrow streets near the lanes. Thomas bent over his workbench, his practiced fingers smoothing a fresh piece of Morocco leather across the boards of a merchant's ledger. 42 years had taught him the precise pressure needed. Too much, and the grain would stretch; too little, and air pockets would form beneath. The leather whispered against the bone folder in his hand, a sound as familiar as his own breathing. 20 more of these before month's end, he calculated silently, and perhaps the debt to Wickham's supply house might shrink to something manageable. The new finishing press he'd purchased in September stood in the corner like an iron promise of efficiency, though its cost still made his stomach tighten whenever he glanced at it. Progress demanded investment, the salesman had assured him, and a craftsman who didn't modernize would be left behind, like the hand weavers after the power looms arrived. "Father, you're brooding again," Mary called from the rear of the shop where she worked at her own smaller bench, carefully sewing signatures with the patient rhythm he'd taught her since she was 12. 19 now, with her mother's quick wit and steadier hands than his own had been at that age. She'd inherited Eleanor's directness, too, though grief had softened it these 3 years since the cholera took her mother. "Thinking," he corrected, though she was right. The October accounts would come due soon, and the merchants were growing slower with their payments. Everyone wanted their books bound on credit these days, as if craftsmanship could sustain itself on promises alone. The shop bell chimed, its brass voice cutting through the workshop's quiet concentration. Not a customer at this hour, but young Timothy Fletcher from the post office, his cap askew and cheeks flushed from running. "Letter for you, Mr. Hartwell. Came express from Sussex. The sender paid extra for immediate delivery." Thomas wiped his hands on his leather apron before accepting the envelope. Heavy paper, expensive, with a wax seal bearing an elaborate coat of arms, a raven clutching a golden key. The handwriting alone spoke of education and authority. Inside, the message was brief but intriguing. Lord Edmund Blackmore of Blackmore Hall required his particular expertise for the restoration of a family heirloom, a Bible of considerable age and significance. The sum mentioned for the commission made Thomas read the figure twice. Enough to clear the debt entirely, he thought, and perhaps set aside something for Mary's future. Though lately she'd been corresponding with someone. He'd noticed her hiding letters when he entered the room, that particular smile young women got when they thought themselves in love. The printer's apprentice from Kemptown, most likely. The boy had been finding excuses to deliver orders personally for months now. "Good news?" Mary asked, looking up from her work. She'd pricked her finger with the needle, he noticed, a small spot of blood on the linen thread. Even the steadiest hands could be startled by possibility. "A commission. Blackmore Hall in Sussex. I'll need to travel." Her face showed a flicker of something. Relief? Disappointment? "When?" "Day after tomorrow, if I'm to accept." He folded the letter carefully. The Blackmores were old aristocracy, the kind whose names appeared in history books rather than trade directories. Whatever restoration they needed would require his finest work, but also his greatest caution. The powerful had ways of avoiding payment if the work didn't meet their expectations, and their expectations often shifted like shadows at dusk. That evening, as Thomas prepared his traveling case with his most essential tools, paring knives, bone folders, his precious set of finishing tools inherited from his master, he caught Mary at the kitchen table, writing by candlelight despite the gas lamp being within reach. She covered the paper quickly, but not before he glimpsed the words, "Cannot possibly accept." Let her have her secrets, he decided. God knew he'd had enough of his own at that age, though none that had led anywhere beyond this workshop. Perhaps that was for the best. A craftsman's life offered few disappointments if one's ambitions remained modest. Still, watching his daughter struggle with whatever decision weighed on her, he wondered if he'd taught her too well to be cautious, to measure twice and cut once, to always consider the consequences of each choice. The gas lamps outside hissed and flickered, casting dancing shadows through the workshop windows. Tomorrow he would prepare the merchant's ledgers for Mary to complete in his absence. The day after, he would take the early train to Sussex, to whatever mystery awaited at Blackmore Hall. For now, though, he returned to his bench, to the familiar comfort of leather and thread, of problems that could be solved with patience and skill, rather than speculation about the future. The journey from Brighton to Blackmore Hall took Thomas through countryside that seemed to step backward through time with each mile. The train gave way to a hired carriage at Horsham, and by the time he reached the estate's iron gates on October 17th, the modern world felt like something half-remembered from a dream. Ancient oaks lined the drive, their branches forming a tunnel that filtered the afternoon light into fragments of gold and shadow. Blackmore Hall rose from the Sussex Downs like something grown from the earth rather than built upon it, Tudor timber and Victorian additions wrestling for dominance across its facade. Mrs. Adelaide Finch, the housekeeper, met him at the entrance, her bearing as rigid as the whalebone surely reinforcing her black bombazine dress. 62 years had etched themselves into her face, but her eyes remained sharp as a bookbinder's awl. "Mr. Hartwell, her ladyship is expecting you in the library." The house swallowed sound the way old houses do, centuries of secrets absorbed into wood and stone. Thomas followed Mrs. Finch through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to track their progress. The smell here was different from Brighton's coal smoke and sea salt. Old wood, beeswax polish, and something else, faintly medicinal, that made him think of sick rooms. Lady Catherine Blackmore stood before the library's great window, her silhouette aristocratic against the dying light. 51 years had treated her kindly, though worry had recently taken up residence in the lines around her mouth. When she turned, Thomas saw fear barely concealed behind breeding and propriety. "Mr. Hartwell, thank you for responding so quickly." Her voice carried that particular tone of the upper classes, each word precisely placed. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" Before he could respond beyond pleasantries, she moved to an oak table where a book lay covered in black velvet. "This is why you're here." She lifted the cloth with the reverence one might show a religious relic. "The Blackmore Bible. Bound in 1642 from my husband's ancestor, Sir Francis Blackmore." Thomas approached slowly, his craftsman's eye already cataloging details. The binding was exceptional. Dark calfskin with elaborate blind tooling, brass clasps green with age, and across the front cover, an intricate design in gold leaf depicting the same raven and key from the family seal. But the gold was wrong. Where it should have gleamed, dark patches spread like a disease across the surface, the metal tarnished to near black in places. "The darkening began 3 months ago," Lady Catherine said quietly. "The same week Edmund fell ill." Here it comes, Thomas thought. The reason for the urgency, the generous payment. The wealthy had their superstitions like anyone else, only with better staging. "There is a legend," she continued, her fingers hovering above but not touching the darkened gold. "The Bible's gold darkens when the head of the family faces mortal danger. It happened in 1721, before my husband's great-grandfather died of consumption. Again in 1794, when the fourth Lord Blackmore was thrown from his horse." She met Thomas's eyes directly. "I know how it sounds to modern ears, but the evidence—" "May I examine it more closely?" Thomas kept his voice neutral, professional. He'd learned long ago that challenging a client's beliefs directly led nowhere productive. As he bent over the binding with his magnifying glass, the library door opened. A younger man entered, 28 perhaps, with a kind of careful grooming that suggested ambition rather than vanity. Samuel Blackmore, Lady Catherine's introduction confirmed, Lord Edmund's nephew. "Still pursuing this nonsense, Aunt Catherine?" Samuel's tone danced along the edge of disrespect. "Uncle Edmund needs proper medical attention, not—" He glanced at Thomas. "Craftsman and superstition. Dr. Pemberton visits daily," Lady Catherine replied coldly. "Your uncle's condition doesn't respond to treatment." Thomas continued his examination, letting their family tension wash over him while his fingers found what his eyes had already suspected. The gold leaf wasn't pure. The texture was wrong, the weight of it. German work, if he was right, using an alloy rather than pure gold. Practical craftsmen, the Germans, always finding ways to make materials go further. "How long will the restoration require?" Samuel asked, moving closer to peer over Thomas's shoulder. The smell of his pomade was overwhelming, bergamot and something sharp, chemical. "Difficult to say without proper examination. Several weeks, perhaps." "Weeks?" Samuel's voice rose slightly. "Surely it can't take that long to apply new gold leaf." Ah, Thomas thought, someone anxious about timing. He'd seen enough inheritance disputes to recognize the signs. "Proper restoration cannot be rushed, Mr. Blackmore. To do so would risk damaging the original binding irreparably." Lady Catherine led them from the library to show Thomas where he would work, a small study adjacent to Lord Edmund's chambers. "Edmund likes the Bible near," she explained. "Even in his current state, he finds comfort knowing it's close." The study felt different from the rest of the house, newer somehow, despite the Tudor beams. Thomas noticed the modern gas lamps immediately, their brass fittings bright against the old wood. The smell he'd noticed earlier was stronger here, that medicinal quality mixed with something else. The gas lighting was Edmund's one concession to modernity, Lady Catherine said, following his gaze. Installed just before he fell ill. He said reading by candlelight was straining his eyes. Through the connecting door, Thomas glimpsed a figure in the great bed, Lord Edmund, 58 years reduced to shadow and labored breathing. The man who'd commanded estates and influenced Parliament now barely disturbed the bedclothes. Dr. Pemberton emerged from the sick room, closing the door quietly behind him. "No change," he told Lady Catherine, then noticed Thomas. "You're the bookbinder? Come to fix the cursed Bible?" His skepticism was barely polite. "Come to restore a damaged binding," Thomas replied evenly. That evening, examining the Bible in detail, Thomas found himself puzzled. The tarnishing pattern was unlike anything he'd seen before, not the even patina of age or the spots of moisture damage, but something almost organic in its spread. His fingers, tracing the darkened gold, came away with a faint residue that smelled of eggs. Morning light revealed details that candlelight had hidden. October 18th brought Thomas to the Blackmore Library proper, where 3 centuries of family records lined the walls like testimony to persistence. Mrs. Finch had provided him with cotton gloves and unnecessary warnings about the value of what he touched, as if a bookbinder wouldn't understand the worth of old paper and aged leather better than most. The Bible rested on his makeshift workbench, but Thomas found himself drawn first to the family chronicles. If he was to restore their heirloom properly, understanding its history seemed prudent. Know the book's life, his old master had taught him, and you'll know how to heal it. The earliest records were in Latin, beyond his education, but later entries shifted to English. Births, deaths, marriages, the usual accounting of aristocratic continuity. But marginal notes caught his attention, written in different hands across the years. "The gold dims," one read, dated 1720. "Father grows weaker as the sacred binding darkens." Another entry, 1794. "The Bible foretells again, the gold blackens like our fortunes." Thomas traced these patterns with growing interest. Not every death was preceded by the phenomenon, he noticed. The 3rd Lord Blackmore had died suddenly in a riding accident. No mention of the gold changing. But lingering illnesses, those that took weeks or months, those always seemed accompanied by notes about the Bible's transformation. Finding our family secrets interesting, Dr. Marcus Pemberton stood in the doorway, his medical bag in hand. At 45, the doctor carried himself with the confidence of science confronting superstition. "Looking for patterns," Thomas replied carefully. "It helps with restoration to understand how a book has been handled." Pemberton approached, glancing at the open chronicle. "You seem like a rational man, Mr. Hartwell. Surely you don't believe in curses." "I believe in observation." Thomas turned a page carefully, "and I observe that something causes the gold to darken." Whether that something also causes illness or merely coincides with it remains to be determined. The doctor's laugh was bitter. "Tell that to Lady Catherine. She has more faith in that Bible than in medical science. Lord Edmund needs specialist treatment in London, not prayers and restoration work." "Yet you remain," Thomas thought, but didn't say, "taking your fees while denouncing their beliefs?" Instead, he asked, "What are his symptoms precisely?" "Weakness, confusion, severe headaches, difficulty breathing." Pemberton listed them like evidence in a court case. "Classic signs of a blood disorder, possibly pernicious anemia." But the family prefers their medieval explanations. After the doctor left, Thomas returned to his examination. The binding technique was definitely German, the particular way the cords were laced through the boards, the style of the headbands. He made notes in his workbook, sketching the tooling patterns. Whoever had created this had been a master, probably trained in one of the great Protestant binderies of Wittenberg or Hamburg. A letter from Mary arrived with the afternoon post, Mrs. Finch delivering it with the same disapproval she seemed to apply to all disruptions of routine. Thomas recognized his daughter's careful hand immediately, though the contents surprised him. The printer's apprentice, William Garrett was his name apparently, had indeed proposed. Mary had refused him, but now questioned her decision. "He is kind and earnest," she wrote. "But I fear kindness and earnestness make for thin soup, as Mother used to say." Eleanor's words exactly, Thomas thought with a pang. His wife had been practical about everything except her choice to marry a bookbinder rather than the butcher's son her father had preferred. Love fills no larder, her father had warned, yet she'd chosen Thomas anyway. They'd proved him wrong, mostly, until the cholera proved that love couldn't conquer everything. Mrs. Finch returned as he was composing his reply. "Would you care to see something?" She stood rigid as always, but something in her expression had softened slightly. "Since you're researching the family history." She led him to a storage room beneath the main stairs, windowless and musty with age. Pulling a key from her chatelaine, she opened a cabinet filled with what looked like household accounts. "I've been here 30 years, she said quietly. "I've seen the gold darken twice before." "When?" Thomas asked, his interest sharpening. 1858, when the late Lord Edmund, our Lord Edmund's father, had his apoplectic fit. And again in 1867, when young Master James died of scarlet fever." She pulled out a ledger, her finger finding entries with practiced ease. "Both times I noted when the gas lamps were serviced." Thomas looked where she pointed. The entries were mundane, payments to workmen, supplies purchased. But the dates? These repairs were just before the illnesses? After, Mr. Hartwell, to fix problems that arose during the illnesses. Lamps that wouldn't stay lit, fixtures that leaked. She met his eyes directly. "I'm not educated like Dr. Pemberton, or mystical like her ladyship, but I notice things. The gas lights always seem troublesome when the family sickens." Interesting, Thomas thought. Gaslighting was still relatively new, prone to problems, but a connection to illness? Still, he filed the information away. In his experience, servants often observed more than their masters realized. That evening, working alone in the study, Thomas began the delicate process of cleaning the binding. He used his softest brushes first, dry, to remove surface dirt. The tarnished gold resisted normal cleaning methods. Whatever had darkened it had bonded with the metal itself. He would need to test various solutions, carefully, to find what might restore it without damage. Samuel Blackmore appeared as Thomas was packing his tools for the night. "Progress?" The nephew's tone suggested doubt rather than inquiry. "Restoration is a gradual process. Like Uncle's illness, apparently." Samuel moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening grounds. "Though I suppose a gradual decline suits some people's purposes. More time to arrange matters favorably." The accusation hung in the air like the smell from the gas lamps, present but unacknowledged. Thomas woke on October 20th to find frost painting the windows of his guest room, the first real sign of winter's approach. His workroom, adjoining Lord Edmund's chambers, would be cold this morning, not ideal for the delicate chemistry he planned. Gold leaf, even tarnished, responded poorly to extreme temperatures. In his traveling case, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his testing kit. Small vials of solutions that could reveal the composition of metals and their ailments. The Cambridge chemist who'd sold them to him had been pompous but knowledgeable, explaining how different alloys reacted to various compounds. "Your craft is becoming a science," the man had said, as if this were a revelation rather than something Thomas had known for 20 years. The study was indeed cold when he arrived, his breath visible in small puffs. But something else struck him immediately. The gas lamps were lit, despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. Mrs. Finch stood by Lord Edmund's door, speaking in hushed tones with Dr. Pemberton. "Worse in the night," Thomas caught the doctor saying. "His breathing is increasingly labored." Lady Catherine emerged from the sick room, her face drawn with sleeplessness. She noticed Thomas and attempted a wan smile. "The Bible darkens further." "Did you observe?" He had. Overnight, the tarnishing had spread another finger's width across the cover, the raven now almost entirely obscured. Impossible, his rational mind insisted. Metal didn't tarnish that quickly without exposure to strong chemicals. Unless... Working quietly while the household tended to Lord Edmund, Thomas began his tests. A drop of dilute nitric acid on a cotton swab, carefully applied to an already darkened section. The reaction was immediate and unexpected. Not the response of pure gold at all, but the telltale green of copper compounds. Another test with ammonia solution revealed silver. The gold was an alloy, probably what the Germans called red gold, high in copper content with silver added for workability. Cheaper than pure gold, Thomas thought, but also more reactive. The original bookbinder had been practical, stretching his materials. But reactive to what? The tarnishing looked almost like silver exposed to sulfur compounds. But where would sulfur come from in a gentleman's study? A letter arrived mid-morning, delivered by a stern-faced man who introduced himself as Mr. Blackstone from Wickham's Supply House in Brighton. Thomas's stomach tightened. The October accounts weren't due for another week. "I happen to be in the area," Blackstone said, though his presence in rural Sussex seemed unlikely coincidence. "Thought I might discuss your account in person." The bill he produced was accurate but unforgiving. £73, 4 shillings, 6 pence. The new press alone accounted for most of it. Thomas felt heat rise to his face despite the cold room. To be presented with trade debts while working in an aristocrat's home was humiliation calculated to wound. "I'll have payment by month's end," Thomas managed, aware that Samuel Blackmore had appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with obvious interest. "See that you do," Blackstone replied. "We'd hate to involve the bailiffs." After the man left, Samuel lingered. "Financial difficulties, Mr. Hartwell. How unfortunate. Though I suppose this commission will help considerably, assuming you complete it satisfactorily." The threat was polite but clear. Fail to please us and payment might be delayed, disputed, reduced. Thomas had encountered such pressure before. The wealthy understood leverage better than any tradesman. Returning to his work with hands that trembled slightly from anger rather than cold, Thomas noticed something else. The gas fixtures in the room, modern Sug lamps with elaborate brass fittings, showed signs of recent modification. The joints had been resealed with fresh putty, amateur work by the look of it. He made a mental note to ask Mrs. Finch about recent repairs. That afternoon, a chance encounter in the hallway provided unexpected information. Mr. Josiah Crow, the gas fitter who'd installed the system, had been summoned from London to check the installation. Thomas found him in the cellar, examining the main pipes with evident frustration. "Third time I've been called back," Crow muttered, not initially realizing Thomas was listening. "Nothing wrong with my work. These old houses, though, they shift and settle. Joints work loose." "When did you first install the system?" Thomas asked, introducing himself. "July this year. His lordship wanted the best. Proper Welsbach burners, safety valves, everything modern." Crow straightened, his back cracking audibly. "Then that nephew started having me make modifications. More light in the study, he said. Brighter flames. Had to increase the pressure, adjust the mixtures."
Samuel Blackmore ordered the changes? Aye, though he said it was for his uncle's comfort. Paid extra for discretion, too. Crow lowered his voice. Between us, I think he made his own adjustments after I left.
Some of these joints aren't my work. Thomas filed this information carefully, pieces of a puzzle not yet forming a picture. That evening, he tested the silver candlesticks in Lord Edmund's room while the family dined. They too showed unusual tarnishing, the same dark patina as the Bible's gold. He held one to his nose, definitely sulfur, that rotten egg smell barely masked by decades of polish. Working late by gaslight, Thomas prepared new tests for tomorrow. If sulfur compounds were present in the air, they had to come from somewhere. The gas, perhaps? But natural gas from coal was processed to remove sulfur. It had to be, or the smell would be unbearable. Unless something in the system was producing hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. He'd heard of such things from the chemist in Cambridge: improperly burned gas, contaminated supplies, chemical reactions in the pipes themselves. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Lady Catherine entered, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. "You work late, Mr. Hartwell." "The work requires it, my lady." She approached the Bible, not touching it but hovering near, as if it might provide comfort through proximity. "Dr. Pemberton thinks me foolish, believing in the family legend, but I've seen it happen before. The gold darkens, and death follows." "Perhaps," Thomas said carefully, "the darkening and the illness share a common cause." Her eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, a crash came from Lord Edmund's room, followed by a strangled cry. They rushed in to find Lord Edmund on the floor, having tried to rise from bed. His face was gray, his breathing a horrible rasp. As Dr. Pemberton and the servants rushed to help, Thomas noticed something else. The gas lamp in the bedroom was burning with an unusual yellow flame, and the smell of sulfur was suddenly, unmistakably strong. The household barely slept that night. Thomas could hear footsteps on the stairs, hushed voices, doors opening and closing with the careful quiet of crisis. Lord Edmund had been sedated with laudanum, but his breathing remained labored, each rasp echoing through the walls. October 22nd dawned gray and bitter, matching the mood that had settled over Blackmore Hall like dust on unused furniture. Thomas arrived at his workroom early, but not for the Bible. Instead, he began a systematic examination of every metal object in the study and adjoining bedroom. The silver letter opener on the desk, tarnished. The brass fittings on the windows, darkened with the same pattern. Even the steel nibs in the pen holder showed unusual corrosion. Whatever was affecting the Bible's gold was attacking all metals indiscriminately, like an invisible acid eating away at everything exposed to the air. The air itself is poisoned, he thought, then wondered at his own dramatic phrasing. Yet what else explained it? He opened the windows despite the cold, letting October wind scour the rooms. Within an hour, the sulfur smell had lessened noticeably. Mrs. Finch brought him tea mid-morning, setting the tray down with her usual precision. "You're not working on the Bible today?" "I'm working on understanding it," Thomas replied. "Mrs. Finch, you mentioned the gas lamps were serviced during previous illnesses. Do you recall if they burned differently? Yellow flames instead of blue?" Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, yes. We had to clean the glass chimneys constantly. They'd blacken with soot within days. Mr. Crow said it was the quality of the gas, but..." She paused,
seeming to weigh her words. Mr. Samuel was very particular about the adjustments. Said his uncle needed brighter light for reading. When did Samuel arrive at Blackmore Hall? June this year, just before the gas installation began. Her tone remained neutral, but Thomas heard volumes in what she didn't say.
After she left, Thomas conducted an experiment. He took a piece of clean silver, a spoon from his tea service, and held it near the gas lamp's flame. Within minutes, a dark film began forming on the metal. He'd seen this reaction before in his chemistry readings. Hydrogen sulfide gas reacting with silver to form silver sulfide. The gas lines were leaking the compound somehow, slowly, invisibly poisoning the air. A commotion in the hallway interrupted his work. Samuel Blackmore's voice raised in anger. "This is intolerable! I have business in London that cannot wait." Lady Catherine's reply was too quiet to hear, but Samuel's response carried clearly. "My uncle is dying. Anyone can see that. Whether it happens today or next week makes little difference to my obligations." Thomas heard rapid footsteps, Samuel storming away, then a quieter tread approaching his door. Lady Catherine entered, her composure intact, but fragile as old paper. "I apologize for the disturbance. My nephew finds illness inconvenient." "Your nephew seems anxious about many things," Thomas observed carefully. She moved to the window, gazing out at the grounds. "Samuel is Edmund's only living relative besides myself. The estate is entailed. It will pass to him regardless. Yet he seems to fear something might change that certainty." Or he's impatient for it, Thomas thought. He decided to take a risk. "Lady Catherine, I believe the Bible's darkening has a physical cause. The air in these rooms contains something that tarnishes metal, all metal, not just the gold on your Bible." She turned slowly. "Are you saying the curse isn't real?" "I'm saying the curse might be more real than you know, just not supernatural. Someone has arranged for poisoned air to fill these rooms. The Bible, with its reactive metals, serves as an unintended warning." Her face went very still. Before she could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway, Dr. Pemberton, looking haggard. "Lord Edmund is asking for the Bible. He wants it brought to him." Thomas and Lady Catherine exchanged glances. "The Bible should not enter his bedroom," Thomas said firmly. "In fact, Lord Edmund should be moved to another room entirely, one without gas lighting." Pemberton's laugh was bitter. "Move him? He can barely breathe as it is. The journey downstairs might kill him." "The air in that room is killing him," Thomas replied. "I can prove it if you give me an hour." The doctor started to protest, but Lady Catherine raised her hand. "Do what you must, Mr. Hartwell." Thomas spent that hour gathering evidence with methodical precision. He collected samples of the tarnish from various metals, tested the gas flames in different rooms, even examined the modified joints Mr. Crow had mentioned. In the cellar, he found what he was looking for, an auxiliary pipe recently installed that connected Lord Edmund's rooms directly to the main gas line. But this pipe ran through the coal cellar, where residual coal gas could mix with the natural gas, introducing sulfur compounds into the supply. When he returned to the study, he found an unexpected gathering. Samuel had returned from his aborted departure. Mr. Crow had been summoned again, and even Reverend William Gray, the elderly vicar, had arrived for what everyone assumed were last rites. They all turned as Thomas entered. "Well?" Lady Catherine asked. Thomas chose his words carefully, aware of his position. a tradesman among gentlefolk, bearing news that would disturb every power balance in the room. The gas supply to these rooms has been contaminated. Sulfur compounds are leaking into the air, slowly poisoning anyone who breathes them for extended periods. The Bible's gold, being an alloy containing silver and copper, reacts visibly to these compounds. It's not predicting death, it's warning of danger. Samuel's face flushed. This is absurd. You're a bookbinder, not a physician or chemist. No, Thomas agreed, but I know metals, and I know what tarnishes them. Mr. Crow, would you examine the auxiliary pipe in the cellar, the one installed in July? The gas fitter looked uncomfortable but nodded. As the group moved toward the cellar, Thomas noticed Samuel edging toward the door. "Leaving again, Mr. Blackmore?" he asked loudly enough for all to hear. Samuel stopped, trapped by social convention and the watching eyes. They descended together into the musty cellar, where Crow quickly found the pipe Thomas had identified. The fitter examined it with growing alarm. "This isn't right. This connection, it's been modified. The safety valve's been reversed, and there's..." He produced a small tool, loosening a joint slightly. The smell of rotten eggs immediately filled the space. "Shut it off!" Pemberton ordered, covering his nose.
Good God, that's hydrogen sulfide. Crow worked quickly, his professional pride evidently wounded. "This wasn't my work. Someone's tampered with it, made it so gas from the old coal stores mixes with the main supply." All eyes turned to Samuel, who stood very still, calculating. Thomas watched him weigh his options: denial, flight, or something else. The silence in the cellar stretched taut as new leather, everyone waiting for Samuel to speak. Instead, it was Reverend Gray who broke the tension, his 67 years lending authority to his quiet words. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion upstairs, where Lord Edmund's needs can be attended to." The group filed up from the cellar, but Thomas noticed Samuel's hands trembling slightly as he gripped the rail. Fear or anger, Thomas wondered. In his experience, guilty men rarely showed just one emotion when cornered. Back in the study, Thomas laid out his evidence methodically, like pieces of a disassembled binding. The tarnish samples, his test results, the timeline of Lord Edmund's illness corresponding exactly with the gas modifications. Dr. Pemberton examined each item with growing comprehension, his medical training allowing him to grasp the implications quickly. "Chronic hydrogen sulfide exposure," the doctor muttered, half to himself. "It would explain everything. The headaches, respiratory distress, confusion. At low concentrations, it's insidious. The victim might not even notice the smell after a while, as it deadens the sense of smell itself." Lady Catherine had gone very pale. "You're saying Edmund has been slowly poisoned for 3 months?" "Inadvertently, perhaps," Reverend Gray suggested gently, though his eyes remained fixed on Samuel. "These new technologies can be dangerous when improperly installed." Samuel finally found his voice, adopting indignation as his shield. "You're all listening to a tradesman's fantasies." He's obviously angling for a larger payment by inventing this elaborate story. Thomas felt the familiar sting of class dismissal, but kept his voice level. "Then you won't object to Mr. Crow properly sealing the pipes and ventilating Lord Edmund's rooms?" "Of course not," Samuel replied too quickly, "though I doubt it will make any difference to my uncle's condition." That afternoon became a flurry of activity. Windows were thrown open despite the October cold. Lord Edmund was carefully moved to a room in the east wing that had never been fitted with gaslighting, and Mr. Crow began the delicate work of properly sealing the contaminated pipes. Thomas found himself temporarily forgotten, which suited him perfectly. It gave him time to think and to write a careful letter to Mary. "The wealthy believe their curses are special," he wrote, "but poison works the same on lords as on laborers. Tell young Mr.
Garrett that if he truly wishes to court you, he should learn chemistry as well as printing. The modern world runs on understanding, not just on kind intentions." By evening of October 24th, the change in Lord Edmund was noticeable. His breathing, while still labored, had lost its desperate rasp. He'd taken broth for the first time in a week and recognized Lady Catherine when she sat beside him. Dr. Pemberton, humbled by his misdiagnosis, administered oxygen treatment he'd brought from Brighton, helping to clear the poison from his patient's system. Thomas returned to the Bible, working now with a different understanding. The tarnished gold wasn't a curse, but a guardian, an unintended sentinel that had warned of danger for generations. How many Blackmore lords had been saved by their superstitious response to the darkening gold? Moving sick relatives to other rooms, calling in priests whose incense and open windows cleared the air, taking ill lords to London or Bath for treatment. All responses that removed them from the poisoned atmosphere. Mrs. Finch brought him supper on a tray, lingering uncharacteristically. "Mr. Samuel has been making inquiries about hiring a London bookbinder to finish the restoration," she said quietly. "Claims you're taking too long." Of course he is, Thomas thought. With Lord Edmund recovering, Samuel's position had become precarious. If his tampering with the pipes was proven intentional, but proving intent was harder than proving effect. Samuel could claim ignorance, blame unnamed workmen, muddy the waters of accusation. October 25th brought an unexpected ally. Mary arrived on the morning coach, having closed the workshop despite the awaiting orders. Thomas found her in the entrance hall, arguing with Samuel about access to her father. "I have every right to see him," she was saying, her chin lifted in that way that reminded Thomas painfully of Eleanor. "He wrote that he needed his specialized tools, and I've brought them." It was a lie, Thomas knew. He had all the tools he needed. But Mary's presence shifted something in the house's careful balance. She was young, female, working class, everything Samuel would dismiss. Yet she moved through the house with confident purpose, charming Mrs. Finch, discussing London fashions with Lady Catherine, even making Dr. Pemberton laugh with a story about a customer who'd wanted his medical texts bound in healing white leather. That evening, while the household focused on Lord Edmund's continued improvement, Mary helped Thomas in his workroom. "Your letter was cryptic," she said, organizing his tools with practiced efficiency. "But I understood enough." "This Samuel, he's the poisoner?" "Proving it is the difficulty," Thomas replied, carefully applying new adhesive to the Bible's spine. "He's been clever, making it seem like accident or incompetence." Mary studied the darkened gold thoughtfully. "The Bible tells the truth, though. Even if it's not the truth they expected." She was right, Thomas realized. The Bible had never lied. It had always darkened when the Lord was in danger. That the danger came from within the family rather than from God's judgment was a detail the legend hadn't anticipated. Late that night, unable to sleep, Thomas walked the halls of Blackmore. The portraits watched him pass, generations of lords who'd lived and died by tradition and superstition, never knowing how close to truth their beliefs had been.
In the library, he found Samuel, sitting alone with a brandy, staring at account books. "Come to gloat, bookbinder?" Thomas sat uninvited, studying the younger man. "I came to understand."
You're not a fool. The plan was clever. But why risk it? The estate comes to you anyway. Samuel's laugh was bitter.
You think I modified those pipes? Prove it.
I don't need to. Your uncle is recovering. That's what matters.
Recovery. Samuel drained his glass. Do you know what this estate costs to run? The debts my uncle has accumulated maintaining this monument to the past? I would have modernized, sold off the unproductive lands, invested in railways and factories. Instead, it will drain away year by year, maintaining traditions that mean nothing.
There it is, Thomas thought. Not just greed, but philosophy. The new world trying to poison the old, literally and figuratively. The gold will clear, he said quietly. As the air clears, the tarnish will fade. The Bible will shine again, and everyone will call it a miracle. Samuel's smile was sharp. And you? Will you call it a miracle? I'll call it chemistry. But I won't correct those who prefer the miraculous explanation. People need their beliefs, Mr. Blackmore. Even you believe in something. Progress, perhaps, or profit. I believe in reality, Samuel said. So do I, Thomas replied, rising to leave. And the reality is that your uncle lives, the estate remains his, and you remain his heir. Whether that's curse or blessing depends entirely on what you do next. Walking back to his room, Thomas reflected on the strange ways truth and legend intertwined. The Blackmore Bible would continue to darken when danger threatened, that much was certain. October 26th dawned with frost thick enough to silver the grounds like nature's own gilding. Thomas woke to urgent knocking. Mrs. Finch, her usual composure, cracked. "His lordship is asking for you specifically, Mr. Hartwell. He's lucid this morning." Lord Edmund Blackmore, propped up in his new quarters, looked like a man pulled back from a distant shore. His 58 years showed in every line, but his eyes held clarity they'd lacked for months. Thomas had seen that look before in customers who'd nearly lost everything to flood or fire. A mixture of gratitude and grievance at what survival had cost. "They tell me you discovered the source of my illness." Lord Edmund's voice was weak but steady. "That our family curse has a scientific explanation." Thomas chose his words carefully. "The Bible warned of danger, my lord. That part of your tradition holds true." The older man studied him with surprising shrewdness. "Diplomatic. But I want truth, Mr. Hartwell. My nephew. Was it intentional?" Before Thomas could answer, voices rose in the hallway. Lady Catherine entered, followed by Dr. Pemberton, and, surprisingly, a man in the uniform of a London Metropolitan Police Inspector. Samuel trailed behind, his face carefully blank. "Inspector Harwick has some questions," Lady Catherine announced, her tone suggesting this was not entirely voluntary. The inspector, a methodical man with the kind of patience that came from dealing with London's worst, examined the evidence Thomas had collected. He interviewed Mr. Crow, who reluctantly admitted that Samuel had paid him extra to make the specific modifications, though just for better lighting, he said. Mrs. Finch testified about dates and times with her ledger's precision. Even Reverend Gray, summoned as a character witness, seemed troubled by what he'd observed. "It's circumstantial," the inspector finally said. Mr. Samuel Blackmore certainly showed poor judgment in the modifications, but proving murderous intent, he shrugged. That's harder. Samuel's relief was carefully hidden, but visible to someone trained in observing materials under stress. Thomas recognized it, the same look Leather got just before the tension released. Lady Catherine spoke with quiet authority. "Inspector, we won't be pressing charges. This is a family matter." "But, my lady," Dr. Pemberton began. "The decision is made." Her voice brooked no argument, though Thomas saw her hands tremble slightly. The aristocracy closing ranks, protecting their own even from themselves. After the inspector departed, an uncomfortable gathering formed in Lord Edmund's room. Samuel stood near the door like a man calculating escape routes, while Lady Catherine positioned herself between nephew and husband like a shield. "Samuel," Lord Edmund said quietly, "I know what you did." The younger man started to protest, but his uncle raised a shaking hand. "I know because I recognize the ambition. At your age, I too thought tradition was weakness, that the old ways held us back. But poison, Samuel? I never meant—" Samuel stopped, perhaps realizing any explanation would be confession. "You're still my heir," Lord Edmund continued, each word seeming to cost him effort. "The entailment ensures that. But you'll leave Blackmore Hall today. Your annual allowance will continue, conditional on your absence. Return only for my funeral, and then only if you come alone." The dismissal was genteel, but absolute. Samuel left within the hour, taking only personal effects. Thomas watched from his workroom window as the carriage departed, noticing how even the horses seemed eager to be away. That afternoon, Mary proved her worth in unexpected ways. While Thomas worked on the Bible's restoration, carefully cleaning each section of gold with solutions that neutralized the sulfide without damaging the underlying metal, she organized his notes and observations into a coherent record. "You should publish this," she said, reading through his chemical analysis. "Other bookbinders would benefit from understanding how environmental factors affect their work." "Publishing requires education I don't have," Thomas replied, though the idea intrigued him. "And the Blackmores wouldn't want their business made public." "Then change the names, alter the details." "Make it about the craft, not the scandal." She had Eleanor's practicality, seeing possibilities where Thomas saw only obstacles. Perhaps that's why she'd refused the printer's apprentice, not from snobbery, but from recognizing a future that would limit her own possibilities. By evening of October 27th, Lord Edmund felt strong enough to visit his study. Thomas had worked to clear the air completely, every window opened daily, fans brought from Brighton to circulate fresh air. The Bible sat on its stand, the gold beginning to brighten as the sulfide compounds slowly oxidized away. "How long before it's fully restored?" Lord Edmund asked, running a careful finger near but not touching the binding. "Several weeks for the gold to clear naturally. I could force it with chemicals, but that might damage the original materials." "Let it take its time," Lord Edmund decided. "Some things shouldn't be rushed." Dr. Pemberton arrived for his evening visit, bringing news from London. "I've consulted with colleagues about hydrogen sulfide exposure. With proper treatment and clean air, full recovery is possible. You're fortunate, my lord. A few more weeks and the damage would have been irreversible." Lady Catherine squeezed her husband's hand, the first genuine emotion Thomas had seen her display publicly. "The Bible saved you, just as the legend promised." "The Bible and Mr. Hartwell,"
Lord Edmund corrected. "Though I suppose they're connected in this case." Later, alone in his workroom, Thomas continued the delicate restoration. The binding itself had suffered from years of handling, corners worn, joints starting to crack. He reinforced them carefully, using techniques that would be invisible but would add decades to the book's life. This was what he understood, the preservation of knowledge, the physical act of keeping wisdom intact for future generations. Mary brought him tea as the clock struck 10. "Father, there's something I should tell you. William, Mr.
Garrett, he's written again. He says he understands my refusal and wishes me well."
"And how do you feel about that?"
She considered, displaying the careful thought he'd tried to teach her. "Relieved, mostly. I think I refused him not because he was unsuitable, but because accepting would have meant choosing a life before I'd lived enough to know what I wanted." Wisdom at 19, Thomas thought. She'll go farther than her father ever could. "The Blackmores have offered me a bonus," he told her. "Enough to clear our debts and modernize the workshop properly. We could take on larger commissions, perhaps even restoration work for museums." Mary smiled, that particular expression that reminded him so painfully and sweetly of Eleanor.
"Mother would have been proud. You've saved a life with bookbinding."
"With chemistry," Thomas corrected, but he was smiling too. The morning of October 28th brought unexpected chaos. Thomas arrived at his workroom to find Mr. Crow and 3 assistants dismantling the entire gas system in Lord Edmund's former chambers. Pipes lay scattered like bones across the floor, the walls scarred where fixtures had been removed. The smell of disturbed plaster and old wood filled the air. "His lordship's orders," Crow explained, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "Every pipe, every joint, every valve, all to be replaced. Do it right this time," he said, as if it were my fault his nephew played with the connections. Thomas worked around the disruption, focusing on the Bible's restoration. The gold was clearing gradually, like dawn breaking over days instead of hours. He applied a gentle polish to the cleared sections, bringing back the warm glow that had been hidden for months. The raven on the cover was becoming visible again, its eye seeming to watch the work with approval. Lady Catherine visited mid-morning, carrying a wooden box Thomas hadn't seen before. "I thought you should see these," she said, opening it to reveal a collection of documents. "Records of previous restorations of the Bible." The papers dated back 2 centuries, bills, correspondence, detailed notes from bookbinders past. Thomas read with growing fascination. Every generation or so, someone had been called to repair the sacred book. Each had left observations about the gold's tendency to darken, though none had understood the cause. 1794, Thomas read aloud. Master Binderman Jonas Hartright notes, "The gold shows peculiar tarnishing as if exposed to noxious vapors, cleaned with hartshorn and spirits of wine." Hartright, Lady Catherine mused. "Any relation?" Thomas smiled slightly. "Hartwell, Hartright. Bookbinders often took names from their trade. We might be distant cousins of craft, if not blood." She pulled out another document. "This one's from 1821. The bookbinder recommended moving the Bible to a different room, saying the air in the Lord's chamber was unwholesome. The family thought him superstitious. But he was right, Thomas thought. Even without understanding the chemistry, craftsmen had sensed something wrong. Their observations, dismissed as tradesmen's fancy, had been more accurate than any physician's diagnosis.
Dr. Pemberton arrived with encouraging news about Lord Edmund's recovery. His breathing improves daily. I believe we've avoided permanent damage, though it was closer than I care to admit. He paused, professional pride warring with honesty. I owe you an apology, Mr. Hartwell. I dismissed your observations because of what you are rather than what you knew. You're not alone in that habit, Thomas replied without bitterness. He'd learned long ago that anger at social prejudice was like rust on iron. It only weakened the structure. That afternoon brought an unexpected crisis.
Workmen, removing pipes from the cellar, discovered additional modifications, not just to Lord Edmund's rooms, but throughout the house. Samuel had been thorough, or perhaps he'd been practicing, testing his methods before the final implementation. "He could have killed us all," Lady Catherine said quietly, studying the maze of altered pipes. "Why such hatred?" Reverend Gray, who'd arrived for his weekly visit, offered an answer. "Not hatred, my lady. Impatience. Young Mr. Samuel saw the estate as capital trapped in tradition. In his mind, he was liberating it for better use. Murder as modernization?" The disgust in Lord Edmund's voice carried from where he sat in a chair brought down to observe the work. His recovery had progressed enough for short excursions, though he tired quickly. "The industrial age creates its own morality," the Reverend replied sadly. "Efficiency becomes virtue. Tradition becomes vice." Thomas understood this tension intimately.
His own craft struggled against machine-made books, mass production threatening the careful art of hand binding. Yet he'd bought the new press, adapted his methods, found ways to make tradition and progress coexist. Samuel had chosen a different path, eliminating the old rather than adapting it. Evening brought Mary with news from Brighton. She'd managed the workshop efficiently in his absence, completing several small commissions. "Mr. Wickham himself came by," she reported. "I told him payment would arrive next week. He seemed satisfied, especially when I mentioned the Blackmore Commission." The power of aristocratic association, Thomas thought. Even indirect connection to nobility could transform a tradesman's credit. Working late on October 29th, Thomas made remarkable progress. The Bible's spine, reinforced with new cords hidden beneath the original leather, was strong again. The gold on the cover now showed through the tarnish like sunrise through fog. By tomorrow, with careful work, the restoration would be complete. A knock interrupted his concentration. Lord Edmund entered alone, moving slowly but steadily. "I wanted to see your work without an audience," he said, lowering himself into a chair. "And to ask you something." Thomas waited, hands still on his work. "The Bible will darken again, won't it? If there's danger. If there's sulfur in the air, yes. The alloy will always be reactive." Lord Edmund nodded slowly. "Then the legend remains true after a fashion. The Bible warns of danger to the family, though perhaps not in the way your ancestors believed. Does it matter?" The Lord's question seemed genuine. Whether God's hand or chemistry's reaction, the warning remains real. Thomas considered this. "I suppose not, my lord. Truth works regardless of our understanding of it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the gold slowly reveal itself as Thomas worked. Finally, Lord Edmund spoke again. "I'm adding a codicil to my will. The Bible is to be examined by a competent bookbinder every decade, someone who understands both craft and chemistry. Will you accept the commission?" I'm honored, my lord, though I may not last another decade. Then your daughter, or her apprentice. The knowledge must be preserved along with the book. The binding of wisdom to wisdom, Thomas thought. What better purpose for a craftsman's legacy? Mrs. Finch appeared with evening tea, setting it down with her usual precision. Mr. Samuel sent a letter, my lord, from Dover. Lord Edmund didn't open it. He's sailing for Australia, I imagine. Gold fields and sheep stations, more suitable to his ambitions than English estates. There was sadness in his voice, but not surprise. After the Lord retired, Thomas worked on, adding the final touches that separated competent restoration from masterwork. The Bible would last another century at least, maybe longer.
And when it darkened again, as it surely would, given the world's love affair with coal and gas and all manner of chemical progress, someone would know to look beyond superstition to cause. Mary arrived as he was cleaning his tools, the restoration complete, but for tomorrow's final polishing. "You look satisfied," she observed. "I've solved a puzzle, saved a life, and preserved a book. What more could a craftsman want?" She smiled, beginning to help him pack his tools. October 30th arrived with unusual warmth, as if autumn had reconsidered its advance. Thomas rose early for his final full day of work at Blackmore Hall, finding the house transformed. Windows stood open throughout, curtains billowing like sails. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the corridors finally dispersed. Even the portraits seemed less judgmental, their painted eyes merely watchful rather than condemning. The Bible awaited him in the study, its gold now nearly clear of tarnish.
Overnight, the mysterious alchemy of oxidation had continued its work, the sulfide compounds breaking down, releasing their grip on the metal. Thomas applied his finest polishing cloth, working with the circular motions his master had taught him 30 years ago. "Like breathing life back into the dead," the old man had said, and Thomas finally understood what he'd meant. Lord Edmund arrived at mid-morning, walking without assistance now, though Thomas noticed how he gripped the doorframe briefly for balance. Dr. Pemberton followed, carrying his medical bag, but looking more like a visitor than attending physician. "Remarkable," the doctor said, examining the Bible. "To think this book served as a diagnostic tool for generations without anyone understanding it." "Understanding and utility aren't always connected," Lord Edmund replied. "My ancestors responded correctly to the warning, even without knowing its nature." Thomas carefully turned the Bible's pages, checking each for damage from the months of exposure to contaminated air. The paper, made from linen rags centuries ago, had survived better than modern wood pulp paper would have. Only slight discoloration at the edges suggested anything amiss. "Mr. Hartwell," Lady Catherine entered with Reverend Grey. "The Reverend has a proposal." The elderly vicar cleared his throat. "I've been researching the parish records. This phenomenon, the darkening gold, it's happened in other houses with similar Bibles. The Weatherbys at Thornfield, the Ashfords near Hastings, all old families, all with German-bound books from the same period." "The 30 Years' War," Thomas said suddenly, pieces clicking together. "Protestant refugees from the German states bringing their bookbinding skills to England." "Precisely," Reverend Grey nodded. "They used their traditional materials, including that particular gold alloy. I wonder if they knew it would react to bad air." "Perhaps they did," Lord Edmund said thoughtfully. "Knowledge takes many forms. What we call superstition might have been their way of encoding warnings." The conversation was interrupted by Mary's arrival with the Morning Post. Among the bills and correspondence was a letter that made Thomas's hands still, from the Royal Society of Bookbinders in London. Lady Catherine had written to them, it seemed, describing his discovery. "They're interested in your methods," she said with a slight smile. "I took the liberty of recommending you for membership." Thomas felt heat rise to his face. The Royal Society was for educated men, university men, not provincial craftsmen who'd learned their trade through apprenticeship. Yet here was an invitation to present his findings at their November meeting. "I couldn't possibly," he began. "You'll accept," Lord Edmund said firmly.
Knowledge belongs to those who discover it, not those who inherit the right credentials.
That afternoon became a lesson in unexpected philosophy. As Thomas put the final touches on the restoration, adding a protective coating of beeswax to the leather, visitors came to see the transformed Bible. Each saw something different in its renewal. Mrs. Finch, permitted a rare moment of sentiment, touched the cover gently. "It's like seeing an old friend recovered from illness." Mr. Crow, his work on the pipes complete, whistled appreciatively. "That gold's bright as a new sovereign. Almost makes you believe in miracles." Even Dr. Pemberton seemed moved. "You've restored more than a book, Mr. Hartwell. You've restored faith, not in superstition, but in the possibility that old wisdom might contain truth we don't yet understand." As the sun began its descent on October 31st, All Hallows' Eve, Thomas packed his tools for the final time. The Bible sat on its stand, golden raven gleaming in the lamplight. Proper lamplight now, from oil lamps brought to replace the gas fixtures. The book seemed to glow with its own light. 5 centuries of faith and fear, bound in leather and gold. "Will you stay for dinner?" Lady Catherine asked. "It seems appropriate to mark the completion properly." Thomas hesitated. Dining with the family crossed social boundaries that his careful nature respected. But Lord Edmund added his voice. "We insist. You're not just a tradesman here, Mr. Hartwell. You're the man who solved our mystery and saved my life." The dinner was informal by aristocratic standards, though Thomas noticed the servants' surprised glances. Mary had been included as well, sitting between Mrs. Finch and Reverend Gray, discussing bookbinding techniques with animated gestures. Watching her confidence in this setting, Thomas felt a pride that had nothing to do with craft and everything to do with fatherhood. "A toast," Lord Edmund raised his glass, "to Mr. Hartwell, who proved that curses and blessings might be matters of chemistry, but courage and wisdom remain matters of character." They drank, the wine tasting of autumn fruit and long cellaring. Thomas found himself thinking of Eleanor, how she would have laughed at his discomfort while being proud of his accomplishment. She'd always said he was too quick to hide his light under the bushel of humility. After dinner, Thomas made one last visit to the study. The Bible sat in darkness, but even in shadow the gold seemed to hold light. He thought of all the Blackmore lords who died with this book nearby, some saved by its warning, others not. Samuel was sailing to Australia now, carrying his ambitions to a newer world. The gas pipes were gone, replaced with safer systems. The curse was broken, or rather, understood. "My father would have appreciated this," Lord Edmund said from the doorway. He'd approached quietly, a skill perhaps learned from months of illness. He was a man of science himself, though he never questioned the family legend. He would have been delighted to know the truth. The truth hasn't changed the book's purpose, Thomas observed. It still warns of danger. Yes, but now we know to check the air rather than our souls. Lord Edmund's smile was rueful. Though perhaps checking our souls occasionally wouldn't hurt either. Samuel was family, after all. I should have seen his desperation. Desperation and ambition can look very similar, my lord. Both make men attempt impossible things. They stood together in comfortable silence, craftsman and aristocrat, united by their appreciation of problems solved and mysteries revealed. Tomorrow, Thomas would return to Brighton, to his workshop and his debts, now cleared, and his ordinary commissions. But tonight, he was part of something larger. A story that connected past and future, superstition and science, craft and understanding. "The payment," Lord Edmund said suddenly. "I've doubled it. The original sum was for restoration. The additional amount is for education, yours and others. That Royal Society presentation, you'll need proper materials, perhaps some assistance with the chemical formulations." Thomas began to protest, but Lord Edmund raised his hand. "Pride is a luxury, Mr. Hartwell, but knowledge is a necessity. Take the money. Use it to teach others what you've learned. Let this be the Blackmore family's contribution to preventing future tragedies." Walking back to his room, Thomas passed Mary in the hallway. She was carrying the Bible back to Lord Edmund's bedroom, the restored Bible that would now watch over the Lord's recovery with bright gold rather than tarnished warning. "Tomorrow we go home," she said softly. Yes, Thomas agreed, though he wondered if home would feel the same. November 15th brought the first real storm of winter to Brighton, rain hammering the workshop windows with determined fury. Thomas sat at his bench, but instead of working on a commission, he was writing in a new journal, leather-bound, naturally, crafted from the finest Morocco hide he could afford. The Royal Society presentation was next week, and his thoughts needed ordering like signatures before sewing. The workshop had transformed in the fortnight since his return. The Blackmore payment had cleared all debts and allowed for improvements he'd only dreamed of. New tools from Germany, a complete set of finishing stamps, even one of those modern gas lamps everyone praised, though Thomas had insisted on installing it far from his actual workspace. Some lessons, once learned, shaped all future choices. Mary worked at her own bench, no longer in the corner, but beside the main window where the light was best. She was binding a set of legal documents, her first independent commission from a Brighton solicitor who'd heard about the Blackmore restoration. Word traveled in mysterious ways among the wealthy. One saved lord could launch a dozen reputations. "Letter from Blackmore Hall," she announced, passing him the Morning Post. Lord Edmund wrote in his own hand now, the shaky script of recovery gradually steadying into confident strokes. He was walking the grounds daily, had resumed his magistrate duties, and most remarkably, had established a fund for the study of environmental poisons in industrial settings. "Your discovery should benefit more than just aristocrats," he wrote. "Dr. Pemberton is working with colleagues in London to develop tests for various gases in homes and factories." There was news of Samuel, too, a postscript almost reluctant. "My nephew has written from Sydney. He's established himself in the wool trade, apparently with some success. Distance and disgrace might make a better man of him than privilege ever could. I've chosen to forgive, though not forget." Forgiveness, Thomas thought. Another kind of restoration. Harder than fixing books, certainly,
requiring faith that damage could be overcome without destroying the essential structure. The bell above the shop door chimed, bringing Thomas back to the present. Reverend Gray entered, shaking rain from his umbrella with careful movements. At 67, he traveled from Sussex specifically to see Thomas, a courtesy that transcended social boundaries. "I've brought something," the Reverend said, producing a worn leather journal. "Found it in the parish archives. The diary of Johannes Hartwright, the bookbinder you mentioned, written in 1694. Thomas accepted it with reverence. The binding was simple but solid, a craftsman's personal work, made to last rather than impress. Inside, in faded brown ink, were notes about books, customers, techniques.
And there, near the end, an entry that made Thomas's breath catch. "The Lord's Bible darkens when the air grows foul with coal fire and poor vapors. Warned his lordship to ventilate, but he trusts more to prayer than practical matters. The metal knows what men deny, that poison needs no devil's hand to work its evil." "He knew," Thomas said quietly. 200 years ago, he understood." "But lacked the words to convince," Reverend Gray replied. "Science hadn't given craftsmen the vocabulary to challenge superstition. You have what he didn't, proof and language to express it." They talked through the morning while rain continued its assault on Brighton. The Reverend had been researching other cases, finding patterns across England, old books with reactive metals, houses with poor ventilation, families with histories of mysterious illnesses. It was, he suggested, worthy of a book itself. "I'm a craftsman, not an author," Thomas protested. "You're whatever your curiosity makes you," the Reverend countered. "Johannes Hartwright was just a craftsman too, yet his observations matter centuries later." After the Reverend left, Thomas returned to his journal, writing now with different purpose. Not just notes for the Royal Society, but a record for future bookbinders. Technical details mixed with philosophy, chemistry with craft wisdom. Mary, reading over his shoulder during a break, suggested illustrations. "I could draw the tarnishing patterns," she offered, "and the pipe configurations. Visual evidence carries weight." She was already thinking beyond the workshop, Thomas realized. The Blackmore Commission had shown her that their craft could intersect with larger worlds, science, medicine, justice. He wondered if she would remain a bookbinder or evolve into something else, something the age hadn't yet named. A customer arrived in the afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore, wife of a Brighton merchant, carrying a water-damaged account book. "Can you save it?" she asked anxiously. "It contains our entire year's records." Thomas examined the binding, calculating the work required. It would be tedious, separating each page, drying, pressing, rebinding. A month ago, he would have taken it without question, needing the income. Now, with financial security, he could choose. "I can restore it," he said. "But I should warn you, if your storage area remains damp, the damage will recur. Books, like people, need proper environments to thrive." She looked at him strangely, perhaps hearing something in his voice that transcended trade talk. "You speak as if books were alive." "Aren't they?" Mary interjected. "They carry thoughts across time, respond to their environment, deteriorate or endure based on how they're treated. If that's not life, what is?" That evening, as November dusk settled over Brighton, Thomas stood in his workshop surrounded by the comfortable chaos of his trade. Tools worn smooth by his hands, stacks of leather sorted by grade and color, the new press standing ready for tomorrow's work. But also his journal, growing thick with observations. and a letter from the Royal Society confirming his presentation. He thought of Samuel Blackmore in Australia, building a new life on different terms. Of Lord Edmund, breathing freely in his restored home. Of the Bible, bright with renewed gold, standing watch with chemical honesty rather than supernatural pretense. Everything connected, the old crafts and new sciences, tradition and progress, truth and legend. Mary was locking the street door when young William Garrett appeared, rain-soaked and determined. The printer's apprentice held a package wrapped in oilcloth.
"For you, Miss Hartwell. Not a proposal," he added quickly. "A proposition."
Inside was a beautifully printed proof sheet, Mary's drawings of the Blackmore Bible, reproduced with remarkable clarity.
"My master has a new lithographic press."
"If you and your father write this book Reverend Gray mentioned, we could print it. Share the profits, perhaps. Bring bookbinding knowledge to those who need it." Mary looked at Thomas, a question in her eyes. He nodded slowly. Why not? The age of secrets was ending, replaced by something more democratic. Knowledge spreading like gas through pipes, hopefully with better results. "We'll consider it," Thomas said, but he was already imagining it. A practical manual that was also philosophical treatise, chemistry text and craft guide combined, the kind of book Johannes Hartwright would have written if he'd had the words. Later, alone in the workshop, Thomas opened the Blackmore Bible, not the original, but his own family Bible, rebound by his own hands when he'd completed his apprenticeship. The leather was humbler than Lord Edmund's, the gold leaf simple brass rather than exotic alloy. But it too would tarnish if the air grew foul, warn if danger crept close. All things are bound together, he thought, by invisible threads of cause and effect. The bookbinder's art was just one way of making those connections visible, permanent, capable of surviving time's tests. Tomorrow he would begin writing properly, setting down everything he'd learned. Tonight, though, he simply sat in his workshop, listening to rain against windows and feeling the satisfaction of problems solved, mysteries revealed, and truth preserved in the most permanent form humanity had devised. Words on paper, bound in leather, passed from hand to hand across the years. The gas lamp in the street flickered through the rain-streaked window, casting shadows that danced like memories across the walls. Thomas smiled, closed his journal, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, perhaps new mysteries. But tonight, all was well in the bookbinder's world, everything in its proper place, bound correctly at last.